everybody, and welcome to another edition of Virtually Visiting Writers. Today, I'm really happy to have Brian Turner, one of my favorite writers of all time, and also one of my favorite people of all time. I'm very happy he's here with us on the planet. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a joy. It's good to see your face, man.
Nice to see your face. I've been a big fan of Brian's. First, I was an admirer of his as a poet. His first book was an award-winning, very popular, very widespread book of poetry about his time as an infantryman in the Second Iraq War. It was called Here Bullet. And the second one really dealt more with the way in which, coming back from war, you carry some of the war inside you. It's called Phantom Noise. And his third book is an extraordinary elliptical memoir about the war experience called My Life as a Foreign Country. And today he's going to talk to us about the creative nonfiction writing process. He's going to read a little bit of his work, and then he's going to give us a writing exercise for you guys to use either on your own or if you're in a class through your university or college or other class in which you're studying creative writing. So, Brian, first off, could you talk to us a little bit about your project in My Life as a Foreign Country?
Sure. When I first started, I didn't know I was writing a book, as often happens. An idea or thought comes to you, and you just sort of follow that on one small page. But what happened to me with this one was I got a very strange award. I got the Amy Lowell Traveling Fellowship, and so I wrote about it prior to going, saying, I don't know if if my wife and I would ride elephants in some country or what we might do. This sort of kind of a fluff travel piece about what we might do. And that was on a blog for the New York Times. And there was an editor who saw that in a magazine, kind of an old school editor, who reached out to me and sort of challenged me and said, hey, I think a haibun might be an interesting form for you to sort of use as you travel. And
That's great. Could you define for the audience what a haibun is?
Yeah, well, I'd never heard of it before. I'm ashamed to say I should have known of the form. I didn't. And so, when I looked it up, and I ended up going to Japan, and I stood at the foot of Basho's grave. It didn't help me with the haibun, but it was wonderful to, go there. Brian from Fresno, California, sort of giving a rough sketch of what haibun, how it works. There's oftentimes there's a prose passage, very short, and it's oftentimes like a travel log or a prose journal entry kind of thing, but it usually involves a travel of some sort, which then reaches a kind of epiphany or is crystallized in a short, haiku at the end. So it's a two-part form with prose and the haiku.
And Basho, the great poet whose grave we went to, is famous for his series travel haikus, Journey to the Far North. That's why he's the perfect grave to go to for this project.
Yeah, and I ended up I don't feel fluent in haiku as a form myself. I enjoy it, and I enjoy it in translation, of course, but I've never felt really comfortable in English writing English haiku, And unfortunately, I don't have access to Japanese to be able to do it, to understand the original word, to try to practice it. But in any case, what I ended up doing was a variant of that, which is I would write a short block of prose, and then it would break into sort of free verse, contemporary American free verse, I'd say. And my wife and I, we traveled in all these different countries, and in each country, I was sort of responding to them in my notebooks with these versions and variations of haibun, and I ended up getting about 90 pages worth of material. It was so in a sense, it's all these different fragments, all these pieces in different lenses on different moments. But there were common threads about masculinity, about war, where the remnants of war that I saw in these different places that I went to, the echoes of a war long gone, those kinds of things. And I sent those back to this editor, who was pretty amazing, because he rolled up his sleeves, I rolled up my sleeves, and what we ended up doing was taking those 90 pages, cutting out all the fat, anything that just didn't really compel the eye or move the soul, and we put them in piles. If it's like grandfather stuff or masculinity, if it was childhood, or if it was war experiences, and we had these different piles, which we then, in each one of those, we took the pieces and thought, traditional story structure, if you have a beginning, middle, and an end, or kind of a rise in action, a climax point, and then a denouement, a resolution, we try to create that within each of these piles, right? So now we have a progression in each of them, but we have what we in creative nonfiction we might call threads or strands. And so we had, if you can sort of see, maybe if my three fingers, there's three different strands. There's a beginning, then it would rise up, and then finish. So what happens is you have a lot of these pieces that are then, because we read English from left to right and we turn the pages left to right, you have to have that progression in that order. If I could, I would, the ideal thing would be that a viewer or someone experiencing these moments they would be stacked. There might be three of the threads in the very initial ones, and you would just sort of, you would ingest it or absorb it, and you would just know that moment. And then there'd be a systolic little break, or like a silence that you would cross over, and then you would take the next cluster, and then that would be the experience. But it's pretty hard to do that because it's impossible. So in language and on the page, this was as close as I could get to that. So what ended up happening was we made from 90 pages a 22-page braided essay is what that form is. And that braided essay was published as My Life as a Foreign Country. And then I knew when I had that essay in my hand, I could see that a book had announced itself. But now I had to figure out, okay, figured out the essay, but now what's the book? You know?
So essentially what you did is you took the engine apart and figured out how to put it back together again.
Yeah.
Sort of
yeah.
Learned to be a mechanic by destroying things.
Very much so, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I wonder if you might want to shift into reading us a little bit of your writing, and I'm going to switch our views while you do so.
Sergeant Zapata wore headphones connected to the mine detector in his hands, which hovered 2 to 3 inches over the soil, reflecting the moonlight falling through the bare trees of the orchard. His squad automatic weapons gunner, Lou, pulled security as the mine detector swept from right, left, and back again, pausing here and there as Zapata listened for all that might be buried in the earth. Lou stood with a small foldable shovel in one hand and the barrel of his weapon pointed up at the planet Mars. He mulled over which type of bumper to buy for the '67 Shelby he had stored in the garage of his parents' home back in San Francisco. I was in the animal stall with the prisoners, all the men from the adjacent farmhouses who were of military age. We'd cinched their hands behind their backs, the flex cuffs binding their wrists together, pulled sandbags over their heads. We'd walk them in a silent line from their homes and across the dirt courtyard. The women and children were gathered together in one of the front rooms of the biggest house, given blankets to keep themselves warm, a guard standing in the doorway to watch over them as their homes were thoroughly searched. In the animal stall, each man was separated a few paces from the other prisoners and made to place the instep of one foot over the heel of the opposite leg before being guided down into a kneeling position in the loose straw at the center of the enclosure. The morning call to Azan wouldn't happen for another 2 to 3 hours. For now, we leaned in close to the hooded men and whispered into their ears the words we most wanted to hear from them. How when? How when? It means mortars, mortars. The sergeant to my right was stuck on repeat, circling a prisoner. You know, don't you know? Oh, sorry. You know, don't you? Yeah, you know. I know you fucking know, squirrely little bastard. But it's all right. All you gotta do is tell us what you know. The muzzle of his carbine rested against the man's back. A milk cow stared at us with its huge brown eyes. The milk cow tilted its head from one side to the other, then lowered its mouth and nostrils to snuff its breath in quickly and blast out a short snot of air into the straw, which rose in a cloud of dust and paper-thin husks. Another soldier called out from the haystacks in the corner, I got nothing here, Sergeant. You want me to keep looking? The sergeant seemed to ignore the question. Instead, he leaned closer to the hooded man in the straw before him. You want me to have him keep looking? Why don't you just tell us instead? Hours later, when the dawn breaks over the far mountains, some higher up will realize we've raided the wrong site and that the target house is actually beyond the date palms across the river. We'll have to remove the hoods from these men, gingerly cut the flex cuffs with the sawtooth blades of our Leathermans, and then shake their hands, bowing to them slightly, apologizing constantly, holding our gloved hands, palms out to them. We're so sorry, Sadiq, but my apologies, and I'm really, and so on as we back up, mount our vehicles, and roll out. But for the time being, I stood in the animal stall and studied the bound men slumping forward in the straw. The night wore on. Most of them shivered in the cold, one of them sobbing to himself, while in the front room of the large farmhouse, another soldier stared through night vision goggles at the women and children huddled in a black corner. They whispered to one another, hushing the sleepless children in their laps. And the soldier in the doorway traversed the room with his left eye in a luminous globe, that insomniac green, color of fresh leaves lit from within. And he stopped his gaze on a woman staring directly back at him, whose eyes reflected in bright ovals of phosphorescent green. So clear, the soldier quickly turned away, shuffled, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the hallway, cleared his throat. In the orchard rows beyond, Lou continued to think of San Francisco and Ford Mustangs, while Sergeant Zapata paused with a search coil of the metal detector over a slight depression, closed his eyes, and listened to the earth.
It's heartbreaking. Thank you.
Yeah, it seemed like these moments. I knew that moment that was never going to be in a newspaper. It was never going to be in a story back home. And I think that's part of some of the poetic training that I'd had before, and the idea of poetry of witness being applied in a sense to, for me, I could see that progression within me, having studied poetry first and then sort of, migrating towards nonfiction. But part of the choice in that was thinking, like, what are the moments that should be remembered that might be erased and lost to the great vault of history, that great silence that isn't recorded,
How do you see the creative nonfiction process as being like poetry, have lyrical and narrative elements? How do they blend for you?
Well, I probably, it's probably because I carried so much of myself as a poet into prose. I probably shot myself in the foot in terms of being an author, because I could have written a book that was surely much more widely readable in a sense, or much more accessible. I could have written that. I think, if you go into like a major chain bookstore, this book is usually in the military section, which is really the wrong section for it.
Right.
Because the readers who go there, when they pick up my book and they start looking, like, it's not what they want to read. It should be over in the memoir, literary something, another section of the bookstore. But if I had tried to write that type of memoir, I guess it would have been something like at 0800 we set out with, and it would be very forward progression with linkage and connection. And I think those linkages are really important in fiction and nonfiction. But in poetry, I'm so used to the synaptic gap, that silent space between stanzas and oftentimes between lines or words themselves. And we're so used to working with silence and space that, and part of that is not only because for me, it's not only a place of meaning, it's part of the construction of meaning, but also because it's part of the recognition of the intelligence of the reader, and that they're going to make linkages of their own, and to leave them space for that, and that's part of it. And then another part, so I guess what I'm getting at is, if you haven't read this book yet, for those watching this, it's in 136 fragments, and it kind of goes in and out of time a bit. So it asks and requires a lot of the reader to be involved in that construction of meaning. And I wouldn't want to write a different type of book for a reader, because I want to write a book that might rise to the occasion for a reader, and for myself,
And it's in line with ambitious kind of writing about war, the sort of thing you see in Tim O'Brien and other authors, where sometimes you're reinventing what it means to tell a story, because you're trying to tell a story that is difficult to tell.
Yeah. And I hope you don't mind me riffing with this, but part of it is this book, unlike the two poetry books, goes much more back into my family history and lineage of military service in my family. And so in order to do that, we're creatures of multiple time zones. That's just part of how we are. We, partly thinking about what happened like a month ago. There wasn't a pandemic, and life was different. And right now we're right in it, and we don't know exactly what it's going to be like on the other side. But we're always like that in a sense, because we have the past that's behind us, sort of crystallized, and this moment is fluid. We're in that the salt of the wave crashing in on the shore. We don't know exactly what we're going to discover when we walk onto the shore, but we think we do because you can kind of see Los Angeles in front of us, whatever it might be,
Mm.
And but because we live in those 3 different time zones, it's similar. Like on the page, I couldn't write that forward progression memoir in a sense because to talk about my time in Iraq, I also had to talk about the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and the different people in my family, their experiences, because they were layered into the psychology of me when I was 7, and the construction of masculinity that I can see now the arc of over the course of my life. It's up to this point.
Yeah. In a way, it reminds me of Allen Ginsberg's leaping the synaptic gap so as to reveal the archangel of time, or Robert Bly, his concept of leaping poetry, the mind leaping from this to that, based on Spanish surrealism. Wonderful. Well, let's shift into a different mode. I wonder if you might have, for those who are writing their own creative nonfiction pieces, some kind of writing exercise.
I do. It's a 2-part exercise. One is to get a piece of paper, hopefully a large piece of paper or a few of them, and to draw a map of your childhood home, and to draw it like an architectural drawing. So you get the rooms or one of the earliest homes that you lived in where very crucial things happened. Good moments, difficult moments, whatever they might be. That house, if you could draw from above a bird's eye view with the different rooms, where's the bathroom, what was on that wall, try to remember, those types of things. And then draw what's around it. Was it an apartment building? Was it a house? Was it, whatever it might be? Who and what is nearby? Are there bushes nearby? Is there a mailbox outside? Is there a mailbox down the street with one of those big chunky mailbox things where everybody gathers? Is there a bus stop somewhere? Start to get the streets around it. And then I would stop about there. Whatever the neighborhood was when you were 6 or 7 years old, what was that sort of world as a map? And then, because I think that can be useful in many ways. This is still part of the first part of this exercise, to draw that map and then try to think of beautiful and difficult things that happened and the way someone might mark that on a map. So put a little X where it might be, and then you can write off to the side what that was. Here's where, Tony crashed on his bike and broke his ankle, or whatever it might be. That thing. The first kiss ever had was over here on the street corner, that kind of, whatever it might be, So once that's done, then leaning on poetry again, there's a poem that I think could help us find our way into the next part, which is it's by Yehuda Amichai. It's the diameter of the bomb. So the diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters, and the diameter of its effective range about 7 meters, with 4 dead and 11 wounded. And around these, in a larger circle of pain and time, 2 hospitals are scattered and 1 graveyard. But the young woman who is buried in the city she came from, at a distance of more than 100 kilometers, enlarges the circle considerably. And the solitary man mourning her death on the distant shores of a country far across the sea includes the entire world in the circle. And I won't even mention the howling of orphans that rises up to the throne of God and beyond, making a circle with no end and no God. Right? I know you know that poem, Tony. That's a Chano Block translation and stuff. So I have to apologize because I changed one word, howl in the original. I changed it to howling because it just feels more plaintive in my body, But that poem, it's a very short poem, and when you look at it on the page, it's a bit like a magic trick when you first hear it or first read it, because the very first time, the idea is like, how far is this going to go? How many rabbits can you pull out of the hat, right? And the surprise in that is how far it goes, all the way till there's the throne of God and beyond, making a circle with no end and no God. But it starts at 30, at this little tiny diameter of the bomb. But the thing that's interesting, the entire poem doesn't talk about the source of trauma. It doesn't talk about the fire within, the beautiful or the difficult or the painful or whatever it is in that space that's connected to all else. It only focuses on what's outside of that initial site. Because, and this is really crucial, I think, oftentimes I'm trying to write about, like in my own book, I was trying to write about, myself, or there's a moment with somebody else. I'm trying to write that scene. Oftentimes they're in scenes in nonfiction. And so I'm writing the scene. I'm trying to make sure that we're in a space like a house or a truck or something or whatever it might be, or in a field. But I want to make sure, was it raining? What did it smell like? I want to feel like I'm there. And as a writer, it's so hard to make that space in a scene in a moment and then have people be there and alive and doing what they do, Part of what can help with that is if we make sure, because, with every scene, even like this one right now, when we're like, the rest of the world is still going on, like someone smoking a cigarette in Nepal, and thinking about the past, I'm sure of it somewhere right now. And there's, somebody's getting a tattoo, even though they're not supposed to, because there's a lockdown, but they want to get their tattoo because someone passed away, and they, like, and these life is happening. And there's sounds and there's all the, so even this is a lot of work for one or two details. But if you have a scene that you've written, like something from childhood, like that moment Timmy fell and broke his leg on his bicycle, right? But around that, there were other things happening. So if you take this poem and you use it as a generative exercise, I would write from some moment that you're already trying to write about or you want to write about, but don't write about that. You try to think what's happening outside of that, further, as far away as you can get. In Cleveland, there's a conductor stepping off of a rail car. The person who stepped up on maybe there's like somebody's freight train riding and they're getting through and they got to, maybe that's happening, and somehow that helps with Timmy because Timmy was trying to run away from home, and that's how he got in this problem with the bike and crash. And that's how we find, we can find these connections if we allow ourselves the journey to discover what's out in the landscape of the imagination. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Yes, one of my favorite poems, and I love the way the poem is structured as a series of concentric circles exploding outward from the bomb, all connected to that original, actually created by that, and but also showing, as you say, how every individual moment is connected to that larger map. Of emotional connections. Thank you, Brian Turner, for being our virtually visiting writer and for that wonderful exercise. And so lovely to see you.
It's wonderful to see you. Thanks for having me on the show. And I wish everyone's page as well, because you and I are both book junkies. So hopefully on our shelves in the future, those stories will be with us all,
Wonderful. Yeah.